Have you ever stopped to think about what really happens when someone who has always needed complete control suddenly discovers they have lost it? What happens when a person who always seemed untouchable, full of confidence, and impossible to shake is suddenly forced to face a reality they never expected? What you are about to hear may completely change the way you understand narcissistic behavior. Losing control is often one of the most emotionally disturbing experiences a narcissistic person can face. Control is not simply something they enjoy. It is one of the main ways they protect their sense of safety, stability, and personal value. In many relationships, they become used to knowing exactly how the other person will react. They expect unlimited access, constant attention, emotional responses on demand, quick forgiveness, and someone who is always available whenever they want. Over time, this level of predictability creates a powerful feeling of dominance. They begin believing that no matter what they say or do, the other person will always remain emotionally connected and within easy reach. But everything changes the moment that person walks away and refuses to break healthy boundaries. In an instant, the certainty they relied on begins to disappear. They can no longer predict what their former partner is thinking, feeling, or planning. They lose the ability to control conversations, create emotional reactions, or shape the story of the relationship in their favor. That sudden loss of influence creates deep psychological discomfort because it removes a source of emotional stability they may have depended on for years. Stay with me, because the next part explains why this shift affects them far more than most people realize, and what happens afterward is often completely unexpected. What makes this change especially difficult is that a narcissistic person often sees another person's independence as a threat instead of a healthy part of any relationship. The moment their former partner becomes emotionally unavailable, starts making decisions without asking for approval, and no longer seeks their validation, they are forced to face a truth they have always tried to avoid. They are no longer the center of that person's emotional world. That realization can trigger overwhelming frustration, anger, anxiety, obsessive thoughts, and repeated attempts to reconnect or regain the influence they once had. In most cases, this emotional reaction is not truly about losing love or companionship. It is mainly about losing the ability to control access, attract attention, and influence emotional outcomes. Once that control disappears, it reveals deep fears and insecurities that had remained hidden beneath a carefully maintained image of superiority and confidence. The identity of a narcissistic person often depends heavily on outside validation because their inner sense of self is much less stable than it appears. While they may present themselves as completely confident, certain, and self-assured, much of that image is supported by the reactions they receive from other people. Praise, admiration, attention, recognition, and even strong negative emotions can all become proof that they are important, desirable, successful, or superior. Instead of building lasting self-worth from within, they depend on others to strengthen that belief over and over again. This constant need for outside validation can influence nearly every part of their life. In romantic relationships, they may continually seek reassurance, admiration, and emotional investment from their partner. In social situations, they often become deeply concerned with status, appearance, achievements, or the impression they leave on others. Even a small criticism that most people would quickly forget can feel like a major personal attack. That happens because criticism threatens the perfect image they work so hard to protect. Positive attention keeps that image alive, while rejection, indifference, or losing someone's admiration can create intense emotional discomfort. But that's only part of the story. The deeper truth is even more revealing. When someone who once gave them a steady flow of validation finally walks away, they experience far more than the end of a relationship. They lose one of the main psychological supports holding together their fragile self-image. Suddenly, the compliments, the constant attention, the predictable emotional reactions, and the unlimited availability they once expected are gone. What once felt guaranteed is no longer there, leaving them to face an uncomfortable reality they spent years trying to avoid. And once that reality begins to settle in, their behavior often changes in ways very few people ever expect. This sudden loss can quickly create overwhelming feelings of insecurity, anxiety, frustration, or even obsession. They may begin searching for new sources of validation almost immediately, try to regain the ones they lost, or become completely focused on proving their value to everyone around them. The real issue is not simply wanting attention. It is a deep dependence on outside approval to preserve their sense of identity, personal importance, and emotional balance whenever hidden self-doubt begins to surface. Choosing complete no contact creates enormous psychological pressure because it cuts off the very channels a narcissistic person usually depends on to maintain influence, awareness, and emotional control. In many relationships, they become accustomed to having constant access to another person's thoughts, emotions, daily routines, and personal life. Whether through direct conversations, checking social media, asking mutual friends, or keeping conflict alive, these connections provide the information and reassurance they need to believe they still hold an important place in that person's mind. Even negative reactions can satisfy this need because they confirm that a strong emotional connection still exists. Once no contact is firmly established and consistently maintained, that entire flow of information suddenly comes to an end. The narcissistic person no longer knows what the other individual is doing, who they spend time with, how they truly feel, or whether they even think about the relationship anymore. This complete uncertainty becomes extremely uncomfortable because it destroys the predictability they once relied upon. The person who once felt easy to reach is now emotionally and psychologically beyond their grasp. That unexpected distance naturally creates growing curiosity, rising frustration, and an increasing desire to restore what has been lost. Stay with me, because what happens next reveals why silence can become far more powerful than any argument or confrontation ever could. The pressure continues building because silence leaves countless unanswered questions behind. Without communication, they cannot measure their remaining influence, receive quick reassurance, protect the image they present to others, or reshape the story to benefit themselves. They may begin wondering whether they have been completely forgotten, quietly replaced, or permanently removed from the other person's life. This total absence of feedback often feels even more threatening than direct rejection because there is nothing solid to respond to, defend against, or challenge. As a result, the boundary of no contact forces them to sit with an uncertainty they normally work very hard to escape. Their inability to observe, persuade, manipulate, or trigger emotional reactions can lead to intense anxiety, bursts of anger, obsessive thinking, and repeated attempts to regain access. The psychological pressure comes from losing both information and influence at exactly the same time, leaving them unable to recreate the familiar relationship patterns that once gave them a comforting sense of control. But the story becomes even more revealing from here. The next stage often exposes something they have spent years trying to hide, and understanding this changes the way you see everything that follows. The carefully created image they depend on begins to weaken once it can no longer be supported by reality. Much of their emotional stability comes from believing they are exceptional, highly desirable, deeply important, or always in control. This idealized self-image acts like a shield, protecting them from much deeper feelings of insecurity, shame, vulnerability, and self-doubt. As long as they continue receiving admiration, attention, validation, or complete compliance from the people around them, that shield remains strong and those hidden fears stay buried beneath the surface. However, when an important source of that validation disappears, especially after someone leaves and refuses to reconnect, cracks naturally begin to form within that protective image. They are suddenly faced with undeniable evidence that challenges the beliefs they have held about themselves for a very long time. The person they were certain would eventually return never comes back. The individual they believed could not move forward without them continues living independently, growing stronger, and finding happiness without their involvement. The influence they once trusted so completely begins to lose its power or disappears entirely. These experiences create a painful conflict between the image they have of themselves and the reality unfolding before their eyes. That internal struggle can become deeply unsettling because it forces them to face difficult questions they usually avoid at all costs. They begin wondering that if they are truly as powerful, influential, and irreplaceable as they always believed, why are they no longer able to control this one situation? Why has every familiar strategy suddenly stopped working? Those questions become increasingly difficult to ignore, and the longer they remain unanswered, the more unstable their emotional world can become. What looked like complete confidence from the outside may slowly begin to reveal itself as something much more fragile underneath, exposing insecurities that had been carefully hidden for years. They begin asking themselves difficult questions they never wanted to face. If they are truly as unforgettable as they always believed, why is this person living so well without them? Why does life continue as if they were never essential in the first place? These questions create powerful emotional discomfort because they directly challenge the inflated self-image that helps them feel secure. As that pressure continues to build, their emotional reactions often become far more intense and unpredictable. Sudden mood swings, strong defensiveness, constant irritability, obsessive thinking, and extreme sensitivity to criticism may quickly appear. They may work even harder to find validation from new people, try to rewrite the story of the relationship, place all the blame on someone else, or make impulsive attempts to regain control. Underneath these behaviors is a growing struggle to protect the perfect image they have created, while reality keeps exposing the weaknesses they have spent years hiding. If this explanation is helping you better understand your own experience, take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps more people discover valuable information that can protect them from unhealthy relationship patterns while helping this community continue to grow. But don't leave yet, because the next part reveals why certainty often turns into obsession, and this is where everything begins to change. The moment they lose confidence that they still have influence over someone who was once emotionally available, certainty begins to disappear. During the relationship, they often believe they completely understood the other person's emotions, future choices, and long-term behavior. They expected that no matter how much distance existed, they would always remain an important and unforgettable part of that person's life. That predictable belief gave them a strong feeling of control while supporting a very fragile sense of self. Once that certainty suddenly disappears, it leaves behind an emotional emptiness that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The person who walked away is no longer responding, explaining, defending themselves, or providing emotional reactions. Instead of receiving constant reminders that they still matter, they are left alone with endless, unanswered questions. They may repeatedly wonder what their former partner is thinking, whether they have completely moved on, whether someone else has taken their place, or if they are remembered at all. The longer those questions remain unanswered, the more uncomfortable the uncertainty becomes. Because of this silence, thoughts about the former partner often become more frequent, more intense, and much harder to control. They may replay old conversations repeatedly, revisit shared memories, carefully analyze past situations, or search for hidden meanings that explain why everything changed. Some begin checking social media over and over again, quietly asking mutual friends for updates, or creating detailed stories in their own mind just to fill the empty spaces left by uncertainty. What started as complete confidence slowly turns into constant preoccupation. This growing obsession is rarely driven by genuine love, emotional closeness, or sincere concern for the other person's happiness. More often, it grows from the discomfort of simply not knowing. Most people naturally want closure when a relationship ends. However, for someone whose emotional stability depends heavily on control, uncertainty can feel especially threatening. Being unable to predict, influence, or gain access to another person's inner world transforms confidence into fixation. This creates a cycle of constant rumination that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. Stay with me because the next part explains why finding someone new often fails to solve the deeper problem, even when it appears that everything has moved on. Seeking a replacement almost never fixes what truly exists beneath the surface because a new relationship cannot erase emotional patterns that were present long before the previous one ended. Many people assume that when someone quickly begins dating again, it means they have completely recovered, forgotten the past, or found someone better. In reality, the new relationship often becomes nothing more than another temporary source of validation rather than a real solution to deeper insecurities. At the beginning, the new partner usually provides admiration, excitement, focused attention, and strong emotional investment. This early stage creates a powerful feeling of relief because it restores many of the emotional experiences that recently disappeared. The attention reassures them they are still desirable. The admiration temporarily repairs their damaged self-image. The excitement distracts them from feelings of rejection, loss, and uncertainty. To everyone watching from the outside, it may seem like everything is going perfectly. Yet beneath that appearance, the deeper emotional needs remain exactly the same. The constant need for validation, the fear of losing control, the extreme sensitivity to criticism, and the heavy dependence on outside approval do not disappear simply because someone new enters the picture. As the relationship becomes more familiar and the excitement naturally begins to fade, the new partner slowly changes from an idealized source of endless admiration into a real person with individual needs, opinions, expectations, and imperfections. When that unavoidable shift takes place, the same insecurities that affected previous relationships begin rising to the surface once again. They may demand even greater attention, become increasingly dissatisfied, or feel threatened whenever the new partner no longer provides non-stop admiration and reassurance. The replacement relationship was expected to remove their emotional discomfort, yet it cannot heal wounds that were never caused by the previous partner in the first place. Instead, the same unhealthy patterns gradually return, repeating themselves with someone new. That is why changing partners rarely changes the outcome. Until the deeper emotional struggles are honestly confronted, every new relationship risks becoming another attempt to escape the same unresolved fears, creating a cycle that continues long after the excitement of a fresh beginning has disappeared. But because this temporary solution only covers the surface instead of dealing with the real cause, the relief rarely lasts for long. The emotional wounds remain hidden underneath, waiting to return the moment the new source of validation no longer feels enough. During this stage, anger and desperation often grow side by side because both emotions come from the same painful experience: losing control, losing validation, and losing certainty. When a narcissistic person realizes that someone they once influenced so easily is no longer responding in familiar ways, they can experience an overwhelming wave of frustration. Their anger comes from the fact that reality no longer matches the expectations they held so confidently. Their desperation comes from the growing realization that the strategies they once depended on are no longer producing the same results. These emotional states often exist together, creating behavior that feels confusing, intense, and unpredictable. The anger is usually directed outward. They may blame the former partner for everything, criticize their characters, spread negative stories, or present themselves as the true victim. Doing this protects their fragile self-image by shifting responsibility away from themselves. Accepting that someone has freely chosen to move on without them is extremely difficult because it challenges the belief that they are always important, unforgettable, and impossible to replace. At the same time, a quieter form of desperation often develops beneath the surface. They may become increasingly focused on finding a way back into the other person's life. Unexpected messages may appear. They may ask mutual friends for updates, closely watch social media activity, or look for almost any opportunity to reconnect. These efforts are usually driven by a powerful need to restore certainty and reduce the emotional discomfort created by distance and silence. Stay with me because the next part reveals why these behaviors often become even more extreme as time passes, and understanding this can completely change how you see the entire situation. As anger and desperation continue feeding each other, the emotional cycle often becomes stronger over time. Every failed attempt to regain influence increases frustration. Every new frustration creates an even stronger desire to regain control. This emotional combination can produce sudden changes between hostility, nostalgia, blame, superficial kindness, self-pity, and dramatic attempts at reconciliation. One day they may appear cold and angry. The next day they may seem regretful, charming, or deeply emotional. These rapid shifts often reflect an internal struggle rather than genuine emotional healing. Beneath every reaction is the same painful reality. They are trying to cope with a situation they never expected and find extremely difficult to accept. Yet the greatest crisis is usually happening inside them rather than within the relationship itself. The deepest challenge is rarely losing one particular person. Instead, it is being forced to face the parts of themselves they have spent years avoiding. Many narcissistic behaviors exist to protect a fragile sense of self from feelings of shame, inadequacy, rejection, vulnerability, and emotional pain. By focusing heavily on success, admiration, social status, control, and outside approval, they can keep those uncomfortable feelings buried beneath the surface. As long as that protective system continues working, they may never feel the need to honestly examine what is happening inside. But once a major source of validation disappears, especially after someone leaves and refuses to return, that protective structure begins to weaken. The admiration, attention, emotional investment, and sense of control that once supported their emotional stability are no longer available. Without those outside supports, painful emotions become much harder to ignore. Feelings of insecurity, loneliness, self-doubt, inadequacy, and fear slowly rise into awareness. But that is only part of the story. The final piece explains why lasting relief cannot come from anything outside themselves. What makes this internal crisis especially difficult is that no external solution can truly resolve it. A new relationship, more attention, greater success, or endless praise may provide temporary comfort, but none of these things can heal emotional wounds that exist deep inside. They may continue searching outside themselves for answers, while the real source of their suffering remains untouched within. Because of this ongoing avoidance, the inner tension often grows heavier with time. On one side is the desperate need to maintain an image of strength, superiority, and complete control. On the other side is the unavoidable reality of unresolved pain, insecurity, and vulnerability. Living between these two opposing forces creates enormous psychological pressure. The more they avoid honest self-reflection, the more energy is required to protect an image that is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Eventually, that emotional burden becomes exhausting. This is why it is so important to understand what is really happening beneath the surface. When a narcissistic person appears close to an emotional breaking point, the true battle is rarely about the relationship alone. It is about losing certainty, losing control, losing validation, and being forced to confront the very parts of themselves they have spent years hiding. What looks like anger, obsession, replacement relationships, blame, or repeated attempts to regain influence is often the visible expression of a much deeper internal collapse. Once you recognize this pattern, their behavior becomes far easier to understand, not because it excuses what happened, but because it reveals the psychological struggle that has been driving it all along.